Okay, let's review what we covered last time and then pick up from where we left off. So last time we were covering paragraph 37 through 39. And here we were talking about how knowledge requires this sort of Taoist sort of giving away from reality, right? So this sort of engagement with the nothingness, as Heidegger would put it. So this whole accepting that you don't know everything and having a metaphysical trust in reality, a metaphysical trust in your fellow man, which is as opposed to a trust in experts as such who are themselves engaging in the radical doubt of extreme Cartesianism. Right? Then from there on, we started covering Lukacs. Okay. And in the next several paragraphs, he's describing Lukacs' theory, right? So in paragraph 38 and 39, he talks about communism as a pure subjective self-consciousness, sort of a collective self-consciousness, right? So per Lukacs, the subject is the individual within society, and then society is the object. And this is structuralist because then if that's the case, if society is the object, then what you're really dealing with is social relations, which means that you're dealing with structures of power, because you no longer have society as a whole dealing with material reality. Instead, you have society dealing with itself, and since it doesn't have to face outward into objective reality and have a relationship with objective reality, all that's left is structures of power, right? And so then the dialectical analysis basically reduces to this sort of structuralist idea. And so from there, we're going to continue into a description of Lukacs' theory. So this isn't Haas speaking as to his ideas, this is Haas describing Lukacs' ideas. Marxism is historical materialism, and communism is just the practical application of historical materialism by the class conscious, historical materialism conscious proletariat to society itself. Well, what does that say about the nature of the society in the first place? It means that society is an indescribable totality of individual mental states, opinions, and beliefs. The objectivity of social relationships is merely a result of the subjective mind reifying segments of the totality and treating them as external realities in themselves. So this basically sums up what we were already talking about, which is you don't have society dealing with objective reality, right? You don't have society having a relationship with objective reality. You have individuals reifying these sorts of collective mental states, right? And so man's only relationship is to other members of the society. And per this view, basically have this self-reinforcing mechanism where individuals sort of reinforce each other's ideas about the social relationships, which then reify the social relationships. Thus, here, society has no real determinate content. It is a pure Kantian thing in itself, a mere totality of individual relations that only asserts its existence negatively by the reification, objectification of its constituent parts. Now, what he's referring to is Kant's critique of pure reason, where he basically rejects the idea that man can know a thing in itself, and then he describes a process by which sense data then becomes conceptual data, right? So we have this manifold of experience, and then through this mental process, we contextualize it, and from this contextualization, we then sort of draw out these sorts of objects of experience. This later feeds into Lacan, believe it or not, because Lacan's idea of the split subject very much plays on this idea. So Lacan's idea of a split subject is that basically once a child becomes conscious, the part of themselves that experiences things directly is alienated from the conscious self, right? So in other words, in your conscious self, you're not really fully conscious of the things that you're directly experiencing. And the part of you that's aware of the things that you're directly experiencing has its own form of syntax about what it's experiencing. And that's where the source of meaning comes from, right? So you shouldn't underestimate Kant's critique of pure reason, because it becomes crucial for these sorts of later ideas, including Heidegger. So this whole idea of again drawing out objects of experience from the nothing, that's very synchronous, I would say. I'm not sure that Heidegger directly was influenced by Kant, but there's a synchronicity there between what Heidegger was saying and what Kant was saying. Because according to Heidegger, basically, material reality is like this. It's not literally like nothingness, but experientially speaking, phenomenologically speaking, it's a sort of void. And then from this material void, we then draw out objects of experience in a particular way. And then that's how we kind of come to grips with reality, and how we form a sense of being, right? So that's very much in line with Kant's thinking, I would say. But so he's talking about a Kantian thing in itself, right? So the thing that you can't know in and of itself, right? You can't know it in and of itself. You can only see, okay, well, what is it not, right? And so then you kind of see the shape of it. So you're drawing it out from the void. So he's saying that what Lukacs is saying is that the subject sort of draws society out from the void, in the same sense that Heidegger would say that man draws objective experience out from the void, right? If that makes any sense. All right. This means that material relations of production are rooted in reified mental states and not material reality. Consciousness of them plus action would dissolve them. Material society is then defined by that which subjective consciousness has not yet assumed responsibility for. Right. I really made an effort to read to kind of read ahead, so that way I wouldn't have to pause and think about it. But I got to admit that I have to sit down and pause on this one, even though I did reread it prior. So in some sense, he's taking sort of the Kantian idea and making it much more radical, if I'm interpreting this correctly, which is that because there's no thing in itself that we can objectively know, he's dismissing the thing in itself altogether, right? So there is no thing out there. There's just the social order, right? And so as we grapple with material reality, what we're doing is we're socializing material reality, if I understand this correctly, which really is kind of an insane thing to say. But, I mean, you take Kant a little too literally, and that's where it kind of takes you, if I'm understanding that correctly. Having rejected any specific form of being as necessarily material, including nature, It is only upon failing to render that the totality fully transparent that consciousness may renunciate its aspiration to dissolve everything in itself. Totality is Lukacian sublime. So again, it's this. This is what sort of underlies this idea that you could have this sort of wokest mindset, which is the subject is, even if you were going to say that there's an objective material reality, you're always going to place the subjective reality over the material reality, right? And so then it goes back to like the example of the trans person who says, okay, well, you know, you have a man who says, a biological male who says, oh, well, I'm a woman. Okay, well, the fact that in material reality he has a certain set of genetics and a certain anatomy, that now has to be called into question because the fundamental object is social and not material. I think that's kind of what he's getting at here. All right, moving on. The totality of individual relations in the form of history or society constitutes a type of absolute objectivity, which is not merely a reification, but the free, continuous, and holistic content of every possible experience, mental state, and subjectivity. Right. So basically, yeah, the totality of individual relations and socialization, these sorts of social relations, they're absolute. So if you have sort of a, and per this idea, this is him describing Lukacs' view, not his own view. Per this view, if there's a social reality that's considered to be preeminent over any sort of material reality, right? And that social reality encompasses every possible individual subjective experience. A totality cannot assume self-consciousness since it cannot be confined to any one self. So that is simply the end of scientific socialism. The only thing that can really be known about society is that nothing at all can be known. This is no more knowledge than Kant's thing, right? Which makes sense because to have any sort of science, you have to have an object of study, right? There's this concept in logic where if A and not A, then everything follows. And so I think what Haas is saying is, the point Haas is making is that the opposite true is also true. So if everything follows, if the totality subsumes every possible individual subjective experience, if everything follows, then what follows is a contradiction, right? So if A and not A, then everything follows. Conversely, if everything follows, then A and not A. In a situation where you can have a contradiction, you cannot have any kind of scientific study. So that's the end of science, and therefore the end of scientific socialism. Subject-object distinction reemerges only now between a subjective self-consciousness in the form of party, institutions, etc., rendering transparent and assuming responsibility for all determinations of society, and the totality of relations as the supremely impenetrable object. While I'm on the subject, this actually, ironically, is very similar to Ayn Rand's analysis. Because Ayn Rand's analysis is, you see, when Ayn Rand is criticizing socialism, so she grew up under Lenin, right? But I think most of her critiques primarily primarily apply to this sort of Western socialism more so than Leninism, because she moved to the United States at a fairly young age, and she really didn't become ideological explicitly until she'd lived in the United States for some time. And at that point in time, she really wasn't addressing Stalinists; she was addressing Trotskyists and Fabians, right? And so her critique of communism, ironically enough, is likely similar. It is actually very similar to Haas's critique. Haas coming from a more Stalinist background. Subject-object distinction reemerges only now between a subjective self-consciousness in the form of party, institutions, etc., rendering transparent and assuming responsibility for all determinations of society and the totality of relations as the supremely impenetrable object. As it would have to, right? Because if society is the thing in itself, which can't be known directly, then you have to have an arbiter of what it is. And so then you have the institutions. And so then you have the institutions being the source of ultimate good, which we covered, I think, 2 episodes ago. It was 2 episodes ago that we covered the concept of the institution as the ultimate source of good. That's how we get there, concretely. That's the logic of it. So we are back to square one, and none the wiser in answering. 1. To what extent is society, including all relations of production, itself objective? 2. To what extent is communism merely a subjective consciousness? These are the most fundamental questions of Western Marxism. And that's correct, because if society is the object, and yet is also the totality of every possible subjective experience, then to what extent can we say that's objective? Because it's fundamentally subjective. And then given that that's the case, if communism is the analysis of historical materialism, but by materialism we really just mean subjectivism, then how can we say that communism isn't merely a subjective consciousness? And that's where we're going to leave it for today. We'll pick it up from there, hopefully tomorrow, but we will see. We'll see. See y'all later.